Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today I'm extremely excited to have Mark Stahlman here. I've known him only for 2 weeks, thanks to Bill Frezza here. And it's been amazing 2 weeks. I've learned so much. He's given me so many leads to follow, and I've been following all of them down many rabbit holes and up some of them and just all over the place. So it's been fantastic. So I'm really honored and delighted to have Mark here. Mark is the president of the Center for Study of Digital Life. So Mark.
Shrikant, thank you so much. And I'm honored to have been invited by you and have a chance to speak to this really quite remarkable group that you have put together. What you have done here, as you and I discussed earlier in the week, there are some remarkable parallels between what you have been doing and at least some aspects of my life. I'm going to be 73 years old tomorrow, so I'm about 20 years older than Shrikant. And Bill Frezza, for what it's worth, is in between. Back in the 90s, I organized a couple of salons, which attracted roughly the same number of people as Shrikant is getting for these meetups. Naturally, it was in person. It actually happened in my living room. And many interesting things came from that, including something called the New York Media Association, which was a big deal back in the 90s. So I'm very familiar with the power of these sorts of groups and what they might, in fact, generate. And I just want to be clear from the beginning here that what we are doing at the Center for the Study of Digital Life and its related projects are not academic exercises. So while this is an intellectual salon, and I'm fine, I'm happy to present ideas, living ideas to you, I want to underscore that there is a different vector in which these ideas actually intersect with world affairs, if you will. And that may be a distinction to draw between what Shrikant has been doing over the course of the past 5 years and what we were doing. There was always in our efforts, and continues to this day, these sort of, so how does this impact major developments?
Wonderful, go ahead.
And in that regard, I want to make sure, I always do this, that if there's one takeaway that you're going to get from these 2 hours of discussions, I want you all to remember, we'll return to this multiple times throughout the presentation. You can simply remember it, if you wish, with the phrase from The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy turns to her pet dog, Toto, and says, "No, Toto, I don't believe we're in Kansas anymore."
Wow, wow.
We are no longer living in the world in which every single one of us was brought up. The change to a digital environment, a digital psychotechnological environment, is so fundamental that it is avoided by most people. It is something that might make you uncomfortable. I'm going to apologize ahead of time if some of the things that we say today you find offensive, because they're just not going to fit into the way that you have seen the world heretofore. Let me begin by linking this back to Julian Jaynes, which is how both Bill and I came into this august group. As it turns out, and totally really by coincidence. I was, in some sense, Julian Jaynes' last student. So as Brian or others, Marcel, if he's with us today, can tell you, the end was not a very pretty one for Julian at Princeton. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Freeman Dyson, a quite remarkable physicist at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. But I used to go to meetings of technology executives when I was on Wall Street, and Freeman Dyson was the fellow that most people would point to and say, he's the smartest guy in the room. In fact, he's sort of scary smart. And as a result, very few people would talk to Freeman. And there was a chair, empty chair next to him for just that reason. And so, of course, I sat down and struck up a friendship with him. I was very fortunate to continue in those discussions. And in fact, with a colleague, we had lunch with Freeman at IIS at Princeton last October. Actually, I should say October 19. 20 went by so fast. And of course, Freeman passed early in 20. I brought up Julian Jaynes, and he said, oh, Julian, oh, he's fabulous. He's fantastic. I really have a great friendship with Julian, but you know, he's not very well. And you know, the Princeton Psychology Department is probably not going to keep him on. So if you want to have a conversation with Julian, get on a train and get yourself down to Princeton, which is exactly what I did the week after that. I went to Princeton 3 times to meet with him, and his health was clearly deteriorating. And then once he was actually fired and sent back to his ancestral home on Prince Edward Island, I took it on myself to go and spend a long weekend discussing these matters with him. And I will tell you that at the end of Julian's life, he had many complaints. He complained about being in an academic prison in Princeton. He complained about not being able to write a second book. He complained about not being able to really explore the causality behind the phenomena that he was talking about. And then shortly after that conversation, I learned that he had passed. And so I'm going to try to fill in a few of the links here. But I will tell you that at the very end of Julian's life, and so we've heard, I think, quite accurate descriptions from Brian about one approach to the causality associated with Jaynes's work. And as you've heard from Brian, or at least I heard last week at the same time, Brian was talking about how society had become too complex for earlier mentalities. But he also, as I recall, said very importantly, these are not entirely clear questions in terms of which is the cause and which is the effect. So I'm going to be, in that regard, I'm going to be controversial for modern day social science, which may not be a position that Brian is so comfortable taking. But because we are independent, because we are non-academic, because we have nothing to do with any of the status hierarchies or the funding associated with academia, which I'm quite confident has become worse than useless, but actually by and large quite destructive in its current configuration. We are like honey badger. We really don't give a damn. And so we're going to invert the typical approach that is taken today in social science, which says that society is a construct of what the humans wish to make of it. So social constructionism is the dominant theme. I'm going to completely reject that. That is, as we used to say when I was growing up in Wisconsin, that is totally bass-ackwards. It turns out that quite the reverse, in fact, is the way that human societies develop. They are driven by technological innovations, and the technology is what decides how many people we can have in a particular population. If the technology does not, in fact, support a larger population, it will not occur. So it is not a larger population forcing people to invent new technologies. It rather is the reverse. The technology is the cause. You will find virtually no social scientists today who can say that in public. Many of them might believe it, but they won't dare to say it. It is so totally against the dogma that human beings can make society behave however they want it to. And in fact, social sciences, by and large, today, consists of social engineers who have totally failed in all of their efforts. So we have 100 years worth of mistaken social science. That will all now have to be replaced. And we're going to begin by replacing it with psychology. So one of the goals of this conversation, in addition to getting you to recall that we are no longer in Kansas, Bill has put up the Wizard of Oz picture behind him. You see the wizard there, and the curtain has been opened, and he's the one, of course, responsible for the pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. We're going to be paying a lot of attention to what's behind the curtain here today. I'll also just note in passing what the wizard is doing in that picture behind Bill is operating a radio station. It isn't usually noted, but in fact, oh, wait a minute. Dave from Tacoma is actually still in Kansas. In fact, what the Wizard of Oz movie is about is the effects of radio on the people living in Kansas. So it may otherwise be cast as a dream. It may be cast in any number of ways. And the theatrical presentation required them to do that. But underneath all of this is a radio operator. And at the time that the Wizard of Oz movie came out, which is actually quite different from Frank Baum's book about all of this, radio was a very big issue. I'm not going to go into any great detail about this, but you will be able to Google, if you care to, something called the Radio Research Project. This was funded by the Rockefeller brothers. The total amount of money spent on it starting in 36, 37, in today's money would probably approximate $20 million being spent to try to understand the effects of radio. Fast forward to the 1960s, and we will talk a good deal, I think, today about Marshall Mcluhan. Marshall Mcluhan wound up with a grant from the Ford Foundation, which was the appendix to the Rockefeller Radio Research Project. Mcluhan was given the task and funded to research the effects of television. So this is probably a good point to back up and talk about the whole historical sweep of these psychotechnological environments. So if we set complexity aside, I will footnote this just simply by saying that the modern study of complexity is the result of decades of effort in what would be called systems thinking. The original version of systems thinking was also funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, in fact, by the same man who funded Marshall McLuhan. And he funded the beginning of something called the general systems theory. His name was Ludwig von Bertalanffy. That has morphed through multiple versions and is today called complexity. I am strongly rejecting the idea that anything living can be called a system. An organism is not a system. A society is not a system. And it is that systems thinking approach that has gotten us into so much trouble. So let's set complexity and systems thinking aside altogether. That is not the approach we're going to be using today. Rather, let's focus on the topic of how technology formally causes social structures to occur. Now, when I say formally causes, that will probably be unfamiliar to nearly everybody on this call. It turns out that we have abandoned causality along with many other things in the 20th century. So there's a package deal here that describes people who have lost their ability to understand the fundamental dynamics of what's going on. And so one of the major efforts that we're trying to conduct here at the center is to leap over these reductions. And complexity theory is just the latest version of a reduction, and take us back to a period in which people did not feel compelled to leave out everything important in their explanations because they were not trying to engineer an outcome. It is the engineering impulse that requires people to adopt a reductionist stance. It may well be after the fact. Most of what we describe as science is not fundamental. It is a after the fact rationalization of engineering results. You could think of most experimentation, in fact, as an extension of engineering. And to the extent that theories are then developed to try to explain what the engineering already accomplished, we have a very different relationship, perhaps, than most would consider. Now, I'll just here also footnote that I'm the son of a historian of science, and I was trained as a molecular biologist. So I have both a scientific specific training. I'm a all but dissertation ABD molecular biologist from the early 70s. But I picked up also a great deal from my father about the history of science. And I will guarantee you that most of the accounts that we have to one degree or another, deliberately gotten things backwards. So again, I will apologize if I'm being overly controversial or perhaps upsetting people here, but we really need a quite different way of approaching these sorts of problems. The 5 major categories of psychotechnological environments that we look at begin with the oral environment. And this is what Julian Jaynes described as bicameral. We describe it as oral because that is the underlying communication technology involved. So bicameral winds up being somewhat confusing to people. And of course, Ian McGilchrist has written a rather comprehensive treatment of the bilaterality of our brains. And my guess is that there are people here who have some expertise, maybe a lot, in that whole topic. I will just note for you that that is once again sort of looking for the details while avoiding if you will, the underlying causality and fundamentals. And that weekend that I spent working with Julian a few months before he died, he told me that if he had to do it over again, apart from the fact that he would not have accepted a tenured position at Princeton and would have attempted to be independent, he told me that it was the alphabet that was the cause of the shift from bicamerality to consciousness. You will just have to take my word for that, because I don't think that that is in the written material. Brian can certainly correct me on this, but by the end of his life, Merlin had come to the conclusion that he had been barking up the wrong tree by talking about migrations and population sizes and all of those sorts of issues, but that instead it was a fundamental technology which caused that shift. And this is the shift from orality to literacy. There is a book by that name that I would suggest you might like to look at, Orality and Literacy. The author's name is Walter Ong, O-N-G. It is worth noting that Walter was a protege of Marshall McLuhan. And you will see throughout today's discussion how all roads lead back to McLuhan, which winds up becoming probably the best place to go if what you're doing is trying to build up a foundation for the rest of what we're talking about. So orality, or bicamerality, shifted to a literate society, or what Jaynes called conscious or self-aware consciousness. And that shift is one that has a great deal of literature about it. This is not something which is totally obscure. In fact, I was fortunate to find, it was not easy, an interesting article on the history of mentalities written by a British cultural historian by the name of Peter Burke. I will send a copy of that to Shrikant if he cares to send it to the attendees here. A part of what that particular article highlighted is that a part of the difficulty that we have discussing these things is that we're talking about them in English. Not only is English an alphabetic, literate phenomenon, but it is a quite distinct linguistic environment from many others. And so that the relatively commonplace distinction between analytic and continental philosophy also applies here. And it turns out that the French anthropologists were keenly interested in the topic of mentalities. And that is a parallel development to the work that Jaynes was doing. But there are many others, not just anthropologists, also linguists, also philosophers who have dealt with these questions. So Jaynes, in fact, has a great deal of support by people who are never going to give a citation to Julian Jaynes, that something fundamental happened in the way that we understand the world. Now, I'm being deliberate here in not using words like think or words like mind, but rather understand. And I probably should be even more precise in my language and call it perceive. It is enormously important to recognize that there is a major activity that goes on within our psyches. Again, I will refrain from using the term mind, which is another reductionist exercise, and instead call it by what the Greeks called it, psyche. Sometimes spelled with a U, but we, in our English transliteration, typically spell it with a Y. Psyche, of course, is the basis of psychology. Psychology is the study of the psyche. The English language word for psyche is soul. So I'll pause for a second here and just note that if you remove the soul, because it cannot be engineered, I'm using engineering here quite deliberately instead of experimental science, which I do not believe deserves the kind of credit that has been given, but rather engineering underlies all of this. If you remove the soul, then you've shifted the problem of trying to engineer humans. And in fact, we've all been living in a world in which enormous efforts have been spent in trying to engineer us. I was actually just reviewing this morning a recent document translated from Chinese, because one of the things that the center does with a lot of engagement is to try to understand how the Chinese are approaching all of these problems. And there is a terminology that is used today in Chinese discussions of the internet in particular, because this was a document about something called cyber power and its relationship to Xi Jinping's thought. That all winds up being condensed into something called 4 consciousnesses by the Chinese. But I will tell you, there's no understanding of the psyche or the soul involved in any of that. And this will become a much more significant problem than what we have today. The West discarded its understanding of the soul, arguably in the late 19th century. In many respects, the Chinese and other East Asians never had an understanding of the soul in the way that the West did. And so from that standpoint, we are stuck in a situation where people are unable to understand what they are doing with artificial intelligence. And in particular, the notions that you probably have read about that swirl around AI, that we can someday produce artificial general intelligence, AGI, in which some version of robots being indistinguishable from humans, as was a plot line in Blade Runner, for instance. But more importantly, the question of whether human beings can even survive a phenomenon like that has been very widely discussed, not just in movies, not just out of Hollywood, but a lot of academic treatments as well. And so Bill has again changed the picture behind him to the iRobots. This is the fundamental technological change produced by digital technology. The psychotechnological environment in which we now live, the digital environment, is one in which we must figure out how to coexist with robots everywhere. This is not just Siri. This is not just any of these cute little things that sit on our desk and answer questions for us or sit in our phones. Bill Frezza has been critical of my insistence on using the word robot. He's a software engineer, and so algorithms is something he's somewhat more comfortable with. And so, yes, I use the term robot quite deliberately in order to attract people's attentions. We are in a global arms race today for AGI, artificial general intelligence. You will not read about this in the New York Times. You will not read about this in the South China Daily Post. But billions of dollars are being spent by the defense establishments of both the US and China as well as many others, to try to solve this problem. I will suggest to you that the only path to solving this problem will be tackling the question of the soul. If the soul is left out of this discussion, it cannot be accomplished. But I can tell you that the Chinese that we are in touch with are already beginning to try to work that into their designs. One of the names that could be given for this entire process is the generation of artificial humanity. So I've couched much of what I've been saying so far along the theme that in fact what has been happening here and the reason why we must abandon modern social science totally is because it is constructed around trying to engineer human beings, and it has come to a recognized failure. Sociology, anthropology, psychology, all of these fields, linguistics, they have all hit the wall. And what's beginning to happen is that people are starting to try to come up with new approaches that avoid those sorts of issues. One of the new approaches is to say, well, wait a minute. Why do I really want to engineer humans? Why not just replace them? Why not just over time figure out a way to build robots that can overwhelmingly take on human tasks? So here I will draw your attention to a particular science fiction treatment. This is H.G. Wells's Time Machine. You may have actually read the short novel. You probably have seen one or another of the movies about this, and so you know. Therefore, the plot line leads to a bifurcation. There are the Morlocks and there are the Eloys. The Morlocks, in terms of this conversation, are the robots. The Eloys have nothing to do all day long. And all they do is wait for the bell to ring. And then they line up, and a number of them are selected, and they enter into this underground chamber, never to be seen again. Presumably, they are being served up for lunch for the Morlocks. So this notion that there will be a separation between humanity and the robots is not a brand new one. It came along with the electric environment that we got at the end of the 19th century. The term robot is now about 100 years old. The Czech play by Kopek, RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots. Robot is actually a derivative of the Czech word for work. So I want you to not leave this conversation today thinking that these robots are cute, that we can figure out a way to all live together without doing any more heavy lifting. That what Stanford University and others are telling you about the need for us to get to a point where robots have legal rights, which is just around the corner. The entire human rights framework is now being aggressively applied to robots at Stanford, at University College of London, at a variety of places. I want you to leave this conversation with the understanding, not only are we not in Kansas, but in fact, we have entered into what would previously been thought as science fiction. The robots are already here, or as I would sometimes describe it, the little green men landed more than 20 years ago pretending to be lime green IMAX. And they are now much more widespread. The amount of time and effort, money being spent on this is the biggest single technological development now underway worldwide. And it is enormously important for us to sort out the implications of that. We can tell some of the dimensions of this by looking at the history. And in particular, the shift from bicameral to conscious, which James described, and many of you have gone over in great detail, and Brian is an excellent teacher and much more engaged specifically with what Julian said. And I want to highly recommend in particular Brian's latest book, which I think has been discussed in an earlier one of these meetups. Psychology of the Bible is a real tour de force of how the transition from hallucinated auditory voices to a sacred book, literate world took place. That is one of my go-to examples now, Brian's book on Psychology of the Bible, of how we went through that transition. I'm not sure really anybody has done anything quite as detailed, including James. But that was not the end of the story by any means. For convenience sake, not because it is definitive, and of course, anybody who took a look at what I'm about to describe to you would start asking about boundaries and definitions and how does one thing transition to another and how uniform these things are. So I'm going to provide a reductionist explanation. It was in what Bill Frezza wrote to all of you. The sequence from oral to scribal to print to electric to digital. My guess is that we'll have a chance in the breakout sessions and in the Q&A that follows that to go through some of that, but I want it to be clear that we are trying to describe these as radically different psychotechnological environments. Perhaps not each on the same scale, perhaps not each with the same sweeping impacts, but I want you to think of what we are now going through, the shift from the final phase of the electric psychotechnological environment, which would be characterized by television. We're going through a shift of the order of magnitude of what happened from oral to scribal. So what James describes and what many others have described, some of those others would be the linguist Jack Goody, for instance. There's a lot of literature from Jack Goody. Others would be the work of Eric Havelock. Eric Havelock's preface to Plato, and later his The Muses Learn to Write. And there's a lot of academic discussion of these and other books and so forth. The Orality to Literacy book by Walter Ong also qualifies. So there's a lot of literature about that shift. That is the closest parallel to what we're going through today. But in order to understand that, I'll have to add something that Bill did not have in his description, which is the notion of retrieval. As it turns out, there are only so many forms that society can take. And in particular, only so many forms that communications technologies can take. And so you might expect that somewhere along the way, long after writing and literacy were invented, you would wind up with people who once again would find mythology fascinating. Now, they're not living in a world that is completely structured and shaped by myths, and yet that is the best way they could explain things. Here, of course, I'm talking about Carl Jung. So Shrikant and I have already had this conversation. I'm not going to spend any time here saying anything negative about Carl Jung, I will just simply note that his work is no longer relevant. He described a situation in which people were trying to figure out why they were retrieving archaic behaviors. That is to say, oral or bicameral behaviors. And his observation was correct. That is what the people of his time were indeed doing. And so he came up with these elaborate theories about why people were doing that, all the time missing the formal causality involved. Why is it that the development of electric media in the late 19th century ultimately led to sociologist Max Weber claiming that the world had become disenchanted? Why is it that Nietzsche, under the same circumstances, came up with the declaration that God is dead? Why is it that under those same circumstances, causality was discarded? Religion became replaced by spirituality, and so forth, and so on. This has been the world in which we've all been living, and I'm declaring, and we can obviously get into a discussion of this, all of that was caused by a change in the psychotechnological environment. And so we have a string of these events. The shift to all of those characteristics I just described was not a result of society becoming more complex. This is not the causality involved here. The causality instead is a result of the underlying structures of the technology. Human beings, as you all know, have what psychology describes as plasticity. We are not born with any of the ultimate skills, capabilities, habits that we will ultimately develop. We spend a great number of years trying to sort those things out. And we will get to the point when we have mastered, as I would put it, the gazintus and the gazoutovs of our alimentary tract and our limbs and our locomotion and our basic senses. And by that time, which will take 5, 6, 7 or more years, we wind up in a situation where we're trying to grasp the structure of the world around us so that we can adequately participate in it. Or, of course, in many cases, people will decide not to. They'll decide to rebel and not be a part of it. But that struggle is not the terrible twos. This is not the question of whether we're going to be constantly trying to reunite with our mothers or become independent of the family. That's a different struggle, and it happens under different circumstances. But what Piaget called the operational, the concrete operational phase, which I would just simply suggest you substitute the more usual phrase, that's grammar school. And grammar school is where we learn the structure of the world. And the way we learn the structure of the world is by developing habits to use the dominant communications technologies of that time. There is no way to avoid it. Everybody here has gone through it. Our children, grandchildren are going through it as well. And this is the underlying causality, underlying basis, and underlying psychology, which I'm now about to describe, faculty psychology. Sri Kant, you'd like me to stop around 1 o'clock, or when do you want me to
yes, so,
end my monologue?
Yes. So what I suggest is that there are two. I just want to make a couple of comments to put it into perspective for folks, and then we'll go to faculty psychology.
Okay.
There are two, Mark, there are two big things that I've learned in the last 2 weeks. Okay. One is this sequence of oral, scribal, print, electric, and digital. Now, for those who are trying to wrap their mind around the transition to digital and the scale of it, the simplest way to actually understand it is the scale of what happened in the past between oral to scribal. We are moving from a small group of people living together, like 30 people, 60 people, something like that, to cities, massive cities of 5,000 people, which was what was made possible. Again, with print, what is made possible. So you can look back and see what these technologies actually do. When you are living through it, what happens is that we grew up with a different technology and we got used to using a certain technology. And so you don't easily see that the technology has changed from under you now and what it means. But this easiest way to see the scope of the change is to look back, because that has already happened and it is very well documented. You can see massive changes in the past. So that's one point I wanted to make. Would you like to talk a little bit about that, Mark, about what happened? Maybe, Julian James and with Brian, we have talked a lot about the transition from oral to scribal and what it did for people. Do you want to talk about the transition from scribal to print or print to electric so people can grasp how big a change this is?
Sure. Once again, there is considerable literature on these topics, so we do not have to fly blind, so to speak. The printing press led to enormous social, cultural, economic, political changes. Perhaps the most obvious of those is the nation state. It was only through printing in the vernacular language that you could claim to be French, Italian, German, you name it. If there was not a printed literature, then the transition from scribal into print would not have produced the same effects. Now, obviously, the nation state then in turn leads to empires. Capitalism, as we know it, particularly as it was described by Adam Smith, is a print phenomenon. And you can also tell that because when we transitioned from print to electric, most economic historians think something fundamentally changed. It wasn't Adam Smith's capitalism anymore. I often cite the specific anecdote of the United States of America. First of all, deciding that it needed to go through a civil war to define what it meant, and very quickly after that, it begins in foreign wars. What is the Constitutional Republic of the United States doing with a civil war leading to imperialist wars? Something very strange happened in the late 19th century. The Republican construct became something different. And so now we refer to something called the democracy. There is no mention of the word democracy in the US Constitution. In fact, as many people have pointed out, the print individuals who developed the US Constitution were very negative about democracy. Democracy was exactly what they did not want to happen, and yet it happened anyway. Democracy, as opposed to a republic, these are forms generated by different underlying psychotechnological environments. So the anecdote that I use is that a fascinating group, you can find it Wikipedia page, called the Anti-Imperialist League, was organized, and one of its main spokespeople was Mark Twain. So the notion that the United States would engage in wars and we would now wind up with Philippines as a colony, that is not structurally consistent with the Constitution at all. Neither, of course, are any number of other efforts. Take your pick. Federal Reserve, income taxes, et cetera, none of these things are constitutionally consistent because the Constitution was a print world. Very few people who have commented about this have recognized that the ground changed, and so therefore the structures, economic, political, social, personal, psychological structures also shifted. Those were, I believe, relatively smaller transitions, important, documentable, notable by any historian who cared to take a look at it, but not quite on the scale of either the shift that Julian Jaynes identified or the shift which we are now undergoing from a television-based world to a digital world.
Wonderful. I mean, the way I think of the digital, and I'm just beginning to get my mind around it, is in terms of programs, you know, that we are basically ruled by programs. And the idea that you either, go ahead.
Okay. This is a relatively common situation. It turns out that Shrikant has a computer science degree. And it turns out that he worked for Microsoft. Some of you may have noticed that if you go to LinkedIn, you will find no history for Shrikant. You'll not find his college degrees. You won't find his employment history.
Yeah, I don't use social media much. Yeah.
Okay. It's okay. If you want to know the answers to those questions, all you have to do is ask. Just ask and Shrikant will tell you. But I will suggest, if you don't mind, Shrikant, that as a computer scientist and as a programmer working for Microsoft, you might very well think that programs are what are driving the bus. I'm going to suggest to you that that is not the case. I'm going to suggest that those are the relatively ephemeral, relatively superficial elements that ride on top of something else, which is a fundamental structure. And so it is always a question of looking for the fundamental structures if we're going to pursue this effort to understand psychotechnological environments. And as a one-time computer architect, I'm a bit older, and so I was doing this a few years before you got to Microsoft in the 90s. But in fact, computers are nothing but elaborate memory devices. And as you know quite well, if the computer gets its memory confused, nothing works. Yes. It turns out, for those who care about this, there are ways to instrument what a computer actually spends its life doing. I use that in quotes because it's very important that computers are not alive. They don't have souls. But computers overwhelmingly, every computer, the ones that we're talking on right now, they are extremely busy shuffling things around in memory. The program is just riding like the froth on the ocean on top of a structure that is elaborately designed to never forget anything, to never make a mistake. And so I am suggesting that it is that underlying architectural foundation, which is the fundamental dimension of digital, and the one which humans really now have no choice but to grapple with. So just to quickly summarize in terms of faculty psychology what I mean here. So obviously I haven't had a chance to meet most of you. I don't know what your backgrounds are. I try to make it a rule to not have conversations with people I don't know who they are. So I broke that rule for coming in here at Shrikant's invitation, and I'm very happy and honored, in fact, to be able to talk to you. There may be some psychologists in the room, so I apologize ahead of time by saying in the epic words of Ruby, the intergalactic gumshoe, that modern psychology is bull dada. It is simply and fundamentally wrong and will never come to a satisfactory conclusion. Most critically, perhaps, the error of modern psychology is that it has replaced the subconscious glue that lives between our external senses and our will, our emotions, our intellects, and all the rest of those faculties. There's an enormous hole in all of these theories. If you have bothered to try to follow the literature of modern philosophy of mind, you will find that there's an invented category called qualia, and an enormous amount of debate about how qualia are actually looked at. My advice would be to ignore all that. It's barking up the wrong tree. Before modern experimental engineering psychology, there was a different psychology. A psychology that began with Aristotle in the 4th century BC. The typical work of his in Greek would be called peripsyche. The English translations tend to use the Latin term de anima for this. The best translation is actually done by a professor at St. John's, Annapolis. His name is Joe Sachs. The name of the translation is On the Soul, which is the correct translation into English. I highly recommend that. We at the center actually did a 13-week close read, line by line, in the summer of 2018. It is enormously important to try to grasp that, and there's a vast, vast literature which extends all across Arabic. It extends all throughout Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and then into the vernacular languages. So you could fill a library up with the discussion of this. It's all been forgotten because it is not useful for engineering humans. It was set aside. So the point that I'm going to focus on briefly here is that in-between point. And while there are commentators who would have had 3, 4, 5, 6 different components or faculties or powers that reside between the external senses and ultimately what we do with it, I'm going to go with Aquinas's formulation. As you probably know, Aquinas is a critical figure, and particularly in the history of Aristotelian thought. But Aquinas went out of his way to describe 4 inner senses. Now, let me note for you, what I'm now describing to you is the basis of a 215-page book that we have compiled. Some of it is new essays, some of it is old essays. It's all available on the center's website. The title is Ecology of the Inner Senses. I will tell you that we're knocking people's socks off in some interesting places with this work that we've done. It is a retrieval in the field of psychology, unlike any others that I believe has been done. And in particular, of the 4, So I will name them for you and then concentrate on just two. What in Latin would be called the common sense or sensus communis is thought to be, in this roughly 2,000-year-long agreed upon approach to the human psyche. That is thought to be where all the external senses are collated and not just identified, but matched to each other. And then we have this very important, if you want, you could, and I'm reluctant to do this, but I'll do this metaphorically anyway. I will underscore to begin with, there is zero chance that the human psyche or any other psyche is computer-like. Zero chance. They're not even in the same category. And yet here I will use the language that cognitive psychology and perhaps others who falsely model the human psyche on a computer would use. You could think of the common sense as the input to the inner senses. The other end, if you will, is something called the cogitative power, or sometimes described as particular reason. There's not enough time to go into the technicalities here, but this is where patterns are recognized. So it turns out that we do not intellectually identify patterns. We subconsciously identify patterns. And then we try to rationally sort out what we have already come to recognize. So that's the beginning and the end, so to speak, of this inner sense sequence. There are two more important pieces. And it's those two important central pieces that I think will need to be focused on. We talk about it a great deal in our ecology. I'd be happy to have another conversation with you about this if that seems warranted. The names that are given to those two other faculties are imagination and memory. That is a bit misleading in terms of how we think of those terms in modern use of those words. But it turns out that what we have just lived through is a very distorted relationship between imagination and memory. We have gotten ourselves into a situation where imagination dominates the headlines. So on the one hand, we could take those who have decided that the entire goal of the federal government is to provide equity. As you know, equity is not the same thing as equality. Equity is a utopian project. It's a fantasy project. Equity can never be achieved in human society, and yet we have an administration, Joe Biden's administration, who has claimed that fantasy is their goal. Equity is their goal. Everything's going to be aimed at that direction. It can never be achieved. That's the utopian fantasy. On the other hand, of course, we have QAnon. That is the dystopian fantasy. These are both nonsense. Neither QAnon nor equity can possibly be achieved. So how do we get into this circumstance? How do we wind up with a world in which you might say everybody's mad, as Bill often refers to it, where you might wonder, does rationality even still exist? The correct answer, I believe, to that is we have painted ourselves into a corner where fantasy is the only currency. And literally, I mean currency. So Bill Frezza will also go on at some length about what's called modern monetary theory, MMT. I'm sure some of you have looked at this more carefully than I, but as it turns out, MMT just simply means that your money isn't worth the paper it's printed on. That we can, another $1,400, well, why not $2,000 a month? We have printing presses. Modern monetary theory says you can do whatever you want. It's social constructionism, another fantasy framework, taken to a complete absurd economic, fiscal degree. So fantasy runs the world in which we now live. It is my assertion that that is already being replaced by an environment that is based on memory, because that is the architecture of these new communications technologies. I probably don't need to highlight for you, if you had a chance to read the essay that was suggested for you, which 4 of us wrote and was published a couple of weeks ago by Notre Dame, making sense of a world in transition. Nothing about television is real, nothing. I don't just simply mean that these are talking heads reading a teleprompter. I don't just simply mean there's an enormous infrastructure of producers and advertisers and industry behind it. That's not what I mean. I mean the fundamental technology itself cannot represent reality. Not possible. I will just simply summarize that. Maybe we'll get into some Q&A about this, but your television set is a blinking light puppet show. This is Punch and Judy at 30 cycles per second. Do not believe anything. In fact, if it can be, to a certain extent, if it can be said on television, it's got to be wrong. It's got to be fake. So the recognition that we are now dealing with this phenomenon, on the one hand, we've got a technology that is hardcore. I can't make a mistake. Everything has got to be absolutely accurate. On the other hand, we've got television screaming at us about facts and truth. And you know, when people find their lives completely absorbed in the need to describe the facts, you know they've lost the facts. Nobody would be so concerted around the topic of the truth if they didn't have it, already lost the truth. So we are in this transition from a fantasy world to a memory world. This is the biggest thing that has happened since the Julian Jaynes subjects of the shift from bicamerality to consciousness.
Wow. Wow. Okay, I just want to summarize. I've been working very hard to grasp what is it that we have lost about nature of human beings? Because really understanding the nature of human beings is the foundation. You can't really understand anything else. You can't understand these stages. You can't understand anything because all of it rests on human faculties. Now, the genius of Julian Jaynes is so amazing, is that he's given me a very simple way of putting this together. So this was just this morning. So correct me if I'm wrong, okay? I've just tried to put it together this morning. I mean, the entire model of psychology is kind of focused on kind of stimulus response. Julian Jaynes' point is that creating this mental space between stimulus and response is a cultural invention. It's an invention where you can take in things and you can say, okay, you have this concept of analog eye where you can evaluate various things coming in from memory, from your feelings, look at alternative paths and choose a path. So this idea of mental space, and I was reading Mike Arnold and Thomas Aquinas' concept of, cogitative sense. Cogitative sense is essentially that, of having this mental space where you are weighing multiple things that are coming in from external senses, from memory, from imagination, and deciding what to do based, and that is the root of morality, that is the root of decision power. So, Julian Jaynes, again, for me, it kind of captures, it kind of highlights what is it that we are missing. And that also explains why Julian Jaynes is not accepted in academia, because it's a notion which is very foreign to the way in which the psychology, especially academic psychology, but also popular psychology. Right. This idea of mental space, it's such a simple idea, but it really illuminates what is going on with us. So to me, that kind of captures what needs to be reinstated. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think that is the reason why faculty psychology had to be discarded. Mm-hmm. Because if your goal is to engineer behaviors, then the actual matrix of the internal senses is going to defeat you every time. We're now 130, 40 years into this experimental psychology endeavor. I can also circulate an article recently written that goes in some lengths about the utter and complete failure of modern psychology. It is termed the theory crisis in the field. I'm sure there are plenty of psychologists today who would be very happy to get in front of this audience and explain their theory. But then the man in the office next to that, or woman down the hallway, has another theory, and another theory, and another theory. None of them hold water. And so by removing the inner senses, our claim, taking those inner senses, collapsing them into, and so I should note here for you, some of you who have paid attention to literature will be familiar with the name of J.J. Gibson. J.J. Gibson is probably the single most important proponent on the topic of perception in modern psychology. He winds up being picked up by people who disagree with him on all kinds of other things, but he's sort of the go-to guy. His specific description is direct perception. We go straight from the external senses, skipping over everything in between, and then bang, we're right into all of these cognitive, not cogitative, cognitive processes. So Shrikant, I think you're correct. I think that the problem that Julian Jaynes faced, the hostility that he faced at Princeton and more broadly, is because people recognized that he was pointing us away from their own mistakes. If Jaynes is taken seriously, Brian is now nodding his head, and Brian knew Jaynes much better than I did. So when I first met Brian, by the way, that was because I was trying to figure out the origins of psychology in China and Japan. And in case Brian hasn't noted this, he's written an entire book about the history of psychology in Japan. The best treatment of that subject, I believe. He lived there, I believe, for a decade or so. And so I did not have any recognition of Brian in relationship to Julian Jaynes until I read his book about psychology in Japan, and then I backtracked. And so I will absolutely defer to Brian's expertise as somebody who worked closely with Julian. He was an anthropologist. As he described it to me, he had ideas that didn't fit with the anthropology department and found a kindred in Julian. We are outliers is the best way to describe what we're doing. We do not need approval. We do not need credentials. What we need are like-minded people. And what we need is the overall underlying fundamental direction, the wind, so to speak, at our backs. I believe that's exactly the situation in which we're in now. We are in a transition of enormous proportions. And so I will just summarize that transition by saying I've done this a couple times, I recognize today. So there are a couple of, I'll summarize again at the end. But in addition to not being in Kansas anymore, the characteristic of this new environment, which is based on memory, which is driven by digital technologies, must be less work, because the robots are going to do the work, and more religion, because the humans are not going to be satisfied with a meaningless Eloi sort of life. Bill Frezza, my dear friend, next to me on the screen here, would have described himself as an evangelical atheist. Recently, on his mailing list, actually it was on the mailing list for one of our other projects, Bill was kind enough to note, somebody else decided to get the ball rolling. Look how smart Mark is. Look at all the ideas he's given us. Kind of a guru treatment, which I really did not want to happen. But Bill was kind enough to suggest that he has come to the judgment that religion is the glue, and society is probably cannot be held together without it. So whatever Bill, who is of an age that he is unlikely to suddenly see an angel appear in his living room, is unlikely to change his fundamental biases, if you will, which were formed when he was 10, 12 years old. He's not going to change them. Nobody's asking him to. But Bill's rationality has led him to recognize that there's really something fundamentally wrong here. So, Shrikant, the relationship between our intellect, our emotions, our free will, and the cogitative faculty really still needs to be fully explored.
Let's do that another meetup. I want, because the thing is that this is a lot of things for people to take in. Yeah. The way I want to do this is now I want to go to breakout rooms, let people discuss the ideas that, just that we put on the table, and we will do another meetup on just the faculty psychology.
Good.
Okay, wonderful. Folks, I mean, the amount of observations, amount of insights that have been put on table here is like order of magnitude or two higher than what we normally do. So this is incredible stuff. These are very deep observations. So what we are going to do is we are going to now go to breakout rooms. The breakout rooms will run for 20 minutes. And we have some rules for breakout rooms that allow maximum interaction. The rules are just let everybody speak for about 1 to 2 minutes about their take on everything before you begin the conversation. I'm going to put the rules in the chat here, and then keep on topic, be brief, be courteous, encourage other people to speak. If needed, just click on ask for help and I'll help you. We'll be back here in 20 minutes, and then you'll be able to share your takeaways. Keep track of your takeaways on a piece of paper. It's amazing technology, as I keep saying, and talk only about your most essential takeaway for less than a minute. And you can also put a question on the table if you want. All right, I'm starting the breakout rooms now. So firstly, I'm going to put, so it's time for takeaways. So what we're going to do, we have our standard rules. So firstly, I want to put a link in the chat. This is part of the book that Mark was talking about. This is the chapter by Adam Pugin. This is my favorite chapter. I've been reading it. Not favorite chapter because this is at the beginning of the book, so I've been reading this. This actually does a fantastic job of talking about faculty psychology, the point that Mark was making about what is it about human psychology that modern psychology has lost. This guy, Adam Pugin, does a fantastic job of pinpointing it, and talks about Magda Arnold, whom I studied about 25 years ago, who's brilliant. You know, she has this idea of the role of self-ideal, the role of what role self-ideal plays in human life. She's a very deep psychologist. He also talks about Thomas Aquinas. So it's a great way of bringing all of this together, and it also begins to show you its implications in media with Marshall Mcluhan. So please read that. We'll be doing a meetup on that shortly. Mark, are you back?
Yes, I'm here. Yes.
Okay. So
I should just note for you the book that Shrikant just described isn't assembled as a single PDF at the moment. So there are a series of PDFs. Three of us from the center, myself, Peter Berkman, and Adam Pugin, who's a recent PhD at University of Toronto. We're the ones who assembled all of this. There's also a number of obscure, older essays that we've also included. And so you'll find that all on our website under the heading of journal.
Wonderful. So I think, Mark, this would be a perfect one for us to start going into it, because I will have people read it. I've been reading this. I'm almost done with it. The essay by Adam Pugin. And then we can discuss, we can use that as a jumping off point to go deep into faculty psychology. Wonderful. So folks, it's time for takeaways and questions. Now we have very little time because the information, the thing that Mark was talking about was so incredible that I had to let him finish all his thoughts. So what we are going to do is that we are going to do a fairly lightning round of takeaways and questions. So try to do it 30 seconds to 1 minute. Your takeaways, we've got 4 rules. Type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to line up to raise a question or give your takeaway, or both. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. Number 4, feel free to speak your mind, disagree with anybody on anything, and do so courteously. So it's going to be Bowden, Jennifer, Judith, Joe, Trevor, Brian McQuay, and Brian Nelson. Bowden, what's your takeaway or question?
I want to pursue what you pursued with the gentleman. The mythology and the myths and the stuff with Jordan Peterson and Carl Jung. I really think that is the underlying pattern.
Bowden, let me interrupt you just for a second. This entire paper, is by Adam Pugin, who is a professor at University of Toronto, and he talks about Carl Jung and Jordan Peterson and how they approached mythology and what role that plays and what is the relevance of that and what is it that these people are doing. So that paper does a fantastic job, and we will go into details of it at the next meetup.
Okay, but I'd like to say that there's a clash, and I'd like to say this gentleman is promoting technological determinism, which what Mcluhan,
absolutely correct. Thank you, Bowden.
Yeah,
thank you.
And I think there's an overriding technological determinism. So I want to make that point.
Thank you. We are, as I tried to lay out, we are deliberately 180 degrees opposed to the standard approach in social science, quite deliberately.
Next up is going to be Jennifer, Judith, and Joe. Jennifer.
There you go, I'm unmuted. Okay, so we had a lively discussion in our room, and I'm going to try to be brief about this. So we got into discussion about education, and I quoted an online course that I'm taking. But what we're moving towards now is a world where memory is actually less important. It's the artifact which is evidence of your learning, not what you can remember. And so Paul brought up the idea of, so Judith and I were bouncing the idea of like, how do you teach in this environment? And then Paul brought up the idea of where are the experts? Well, there are none, they're digital natives. How do we tackle this as a society? And I see part of this as this loss of soul, this loss of the humanity, this loss of everything is becoming more reliable on digital. How do we tackle this as a society?
I'm sure many of you are familiar with the passage in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, in which Socrates quotes the Egyptian god Thoth or Tuth, talking with the Pharaoh about how inventing writing would destroy our memory. And he was exactly right. The kind of memory that we had previously conducted, which is to say an oral world where you memorized epic poems, among many other things, that was ultimately destroyed by writing. And we are going through, as I have suggested, something similar. So the memory that we have been deploying in a fantasy world will not survive. What will develop to replace it will be a much, much stronger form of memory. Jennifer, this transition to digital already happened. We will indeed need to figure out how to live with it and how to hopefully thrive under the circumstances. But let's see, as was suggested in my room, sometimes you open up the pizza box and it's got anchovies on it. And Brian had suggested that. And so it's probably a good time to learn how to live with anchovies.
Wonderful. Next up is Judith, Joe, and Trevor. Judith.
Yeah, hi. So yeah, Jennifer we were in the same group together. So I guess you've done a great job at identifying the problem. I'm just wondering if you, having thought about this a lot, would have some pointers or ideas what types of solutions, and specifically in education, as Jennifer said. And also I was wondering, like, if you could talk more about soul and religion and how that's fitting in and what form that takes. Thank you.
In our group, I made a recommendation. I'll do this again verbally. Somebody can put it into the chat if they wish also. I wrote an essay in late 2019, the title of which was Figured Doom, Ground Renaissance. And there are some specifics in there, but let me add one that isn't really discussed there. I've asked many economists what percentage of the global economy today they believe is based on fantasy. And this would, of course, include a significant amount of what we call education. There's an enormous amount of fantasy that gets conveyed in our educational establishment. What would happen if 10%, 20% of that economic activity shifted in its fundamental orientation from fantasy to memory? My guess is a boatload of new billionaires. And so our approach is not a doom attitude at all. It's a Renaissance attitude. And I'm agreeing with you that many more details need to be added about specifically how that is going to turn out. We are spinning off a for-profit strategic advisory company. And a part of the reason for doing that is, in fact, to try to answer that question, to day be working with other commercial enterprises and helping them sort through the problems of how they're going to deal with this. And I should also mention in passing that we're also standing up a graduate school that we call Trivium University.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Joe, Trevor, and Brian McWay. Joe.
So the main question and takeaway that I was going to share was obviously it was related, and I brought this up into our breakout room, and Mark was gracious enough to answer it there. It was the distinction between the fantasy world and the memory world, and what the implications are for that economically going forward. That is a massive shift, and as you had already talked about, the other major thing that I'm really taking away from this is I may have to change my way of thinking about systems in general and systems thinking. I at least have to go through the exploration of, looking at the transitions from oral to squabble to print to electronic to digital. And once I can kind of map that out, I can kind of formulate my own hypothesis as to what I think, how that transition and what the implications are, what role humans play, specifically organizations in general, I would like to know, because, organizations and their change and how they changed, I always viewed it as technology as something that wasn't necessarily driving the change. It was the organization itself that was changing and migrating versus the technology. So you may have given me a lot more work. So, but but I appreciate that. I like to have my ideas challenged, and and again, the role of religion is what religion actually means in the world going forward is going to be interesting. But this is a lot. This is a lot to take away. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Trevor, Brian McWay, and Brian Nelson. Trevor.
Is my audio okay?
Yes.
Okay. My question is, have you guys considered the development of a kind of a new online education and epistemology social media platform that's specifically designed to counteract the various shortcomings of the mind and society that you have pointed out in this presentation? For example, offering an alternative to the low-dimensional rapid-fire news cycle that the public is currently hypnotized by, and replacing it with something that offers superior dimensionality, perspectives, analysis, and epistemology. The goal being to slow down the news cycle and dig deeper into the complexity of events and discover what is actually true.
My guess, Trevor, is that there are 100 people today thinking about that, and many of them will in fact be launching, if they haven't already launched products of that sort. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, these are not the platforms of the future. They're not digital platforms. They are television platforms that have weaponized the advertising funding process. And they were in fact designed by television ad men in the early 1990s. So what the internet became in that regard is a straightforward extension of all of the various efforts to collect data about people by the television advertisers. That is not going to be the future. And so I would encourage you, Trevor, and a part of the reason why we have decided to shift from sort of private consultation, and the center was founded primarily, by the way, to talk to world leaders. And so we spent 2015 to 2020 primarily in stealth mode. The time has come to expose and get public conversation, and Shrikant intersected with us at exactly the right moment for doing this. But I think your question is right on target, Trevor, and many people are going to try to do that.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Brian McWay, Brian Nelson, Mike, and Maritza. Brian, go ahead.
So they get back to this idea of systems theory, which I think has been a very powerful explanatory tool in both the natural and social sciences. So I'm curious, Mark, could you just in one or two points clarify for me why you think systems theory should be challenged, or what the issue is exactly?
Sure. I told you that I was an all but dissertation molecular biologist. What I didn't tell you is that I was, as an undergraduate, really working my fingers to the bone to try to sort these things out. And the conclusion I came to about the age of 19 was that you really had to draw a distinction between live things and dead things. At that point in my own development, I had physics and biology to choose between. And so I voted with my feet and went to biology. The idea that an organism, a living thing, can be described as a system has been tried, as best I can tell, and failed over and over again. So there have been a handful of people that I'm aware of, Brian, we can talk about separately. And I'm thinking in particularly about Fred Emery, his wife, Marilyn Emery. These are people working out of Tavistock and ANU in Australia. Rappaport and others. There was an attempt to formalize biology. If you're going to describe it as a system, other than as a very loose and not particularly well-defined term, you're inevitably headed towards the need to formalize what you're talking about, much as complexity science has done. To the best of my knowledge, Brian, many attempts have been made and they've all failed to formalize biology. And I'd be fascinated if you think that somebody has been successful in doing that.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Brian Nelson, Mike, and Maritza. Brian.
So as a newcomer to this, I found this very persuasive and powerful. And also as a newcomer, what I found most attractive were, just as Judith emphasized, the solutions, not the problems. Mm-hmm. So I'm more interested in the Renaissance than the doom.
Right.
And I like the, what you gave, whether it was in the group or not, I like the leisure and religion both. So thank you for that. As regards religion, I think I agree with Maritza that in our breakout group, it's probably going to tend more towards philosophy, individual belief.
I agree.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Mike and Maritza. Mike, Maritza, and Jean. Mike, I'll give you 1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. You gave everybody else 2 minutes. That's all right.
I found that less time I give you, the more brilliant you are.
No, this is more complicated than anything else you've ever done. The singularity with Kurzweil is what you're dealing with too. Kurzweil took a different approach than you, and probably has tied up with some more sinister people. And so he also started a university, Google University, to educate his things. The Baum and the Wizard of Oz was a beautiful thing, and you got a good answer there, but it didn't work. It didn't work for Baum because we got the Federal Reserve and we lost it. The genie is out of the bottle. How are you going to put it back in the bottle? And one more point: systems theory fails for some things because it's really a system of heuristics, and they don't, and it's very, the nonlinearities are not under control. I don't think you should give up on systems theory, and there's a lot of ideas on experts who might help you. And I'll yield the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any comments?
To answer your question, Mike, what am I going to do about it? The first answer to that is it has already happened. So understanding the world in which we now live, which has already gone through this transition, was the title of the essay, Making Sense of a World Already in Transition. And so the task that we think is most important here is understanding the implications of what has already occurred. So we're not in the futurism business, so to speak. We're much more in the business of trying to help people to understand what happens to them when the psychological ground has been removed, and moving them from the doom reaction to a Renaissance reaction. But we have a lot more work to do to answer those questions. Those are all very good, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Always appreciate your comments and questions. Next up is going to be Maritza, Jean, and Mark Klugman. Maritza.
Hi, just really quickly, since Brian brought it up, I just wanted to repeat, and those of you who come here often, I apologize because I say this a lot. You know, whenever the return to religion or God is brought up in almost any of these discussions, I do mention to folks, what we're talking about here is the requirement of everyone needing a philosophy. Everyone needs something to believe in, whether or not it's God or something else is immaterial. You know, so let's not discredit all this great work just because we don't believe in God. That's okay. Whatever you do believe in, that's what they mean. Just take out God and put in your belief. So that's just the comment I made, and I make it a lot, so I apologize, but it's so important, I think, for open-mindedness. I do want to say here, there's so much I want to say, but I'm not. I just want to point one thing out. I think a couple people brought up education, and a couple people brought up, you know, how do we start with the solution? And my thinking here, it's in one of the small sentences you said at the beginning of today's discussion. And it's the fact that we as a society have forgotten about consequences. I get on my soapbox all the time and I say the problem with the world is sometimes I sound like an 80-year-old man. And what I'm saying to people is exactly that. You know, for every action, every single action that we take, there's a consequence. Every little thing you do in life, every little decision, there's a consequence. We live in a society that is divorced from that. Like, so I hold the very unpopular idea, and I'm going to say it here because this is a friendlier space than others. I hold the unpopular idea that, you know, when you hear people saying women can do everything men can, I'm like, be real, folks. That's TV crap. And I don't mean it to say that if you have the same credentials, the same schooling, the same this, you don't get the same salary. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here, every single individual has their own value, but there is a action and a consequence for everything. So if we pursue things from a banner of absolute fantasy goal, you're never going to achieve it. If we tell our children as we're raising them that the world is their oyster and that nothing can hurt them or harm them, we are setting them up for failure. And if we're setting our children up for failure, we are setting the future up for failure. So that one sentence, it seems so small, and you just said it and never came back to it. So I felt the need to point it out again. I really think the answer to everything stated today starts with that one small thing. Let's remind everyone, small, young, old, that every action has a consequence. That's the way to try to get back to reality. At least I think so. Thank you.
You're correct. We're heading into a radically different understanding of responsibility. That is already underway. It is a significant part of the reason why all this nonsense and headlines and so forth, you need to look past the nonsense, and you got to recognize that people are grappling with, in sometimes bizarre ways, ways to take responsibility.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark and Maritza. Next up is going to be Jean and Mark Klugman. Jean.
Yeah, so this is quite interesting because I was thinking about this all this time. And the mention about religion is a glue to society. Actually, we have very similar discussion. I think I would like to change the religion to spirituality because we have very different religion. I think we actually discussed in Korea that reading group, and we found everybody, when you grow up with certain type of religion, even though you didn't buy into it when you're young, but when you get older, you suddenly go back to it. So that's kind of your psyche baseline. But when I grew up in China, we have no religion. So I have different language. So I think when we have an international society, we have to find a common spirituality or something in common, because religion glue us together. Also the one who have wars between the people who don't glue together, maybe the different glue will fight between each other. So we need to find a common glue. I think that's the spirituality we have to search for.
Thank you. We do a great deal of work, as I indicated in my monologue, with China. And I would just suggest that what I mean by religion here is something closer to what Karl Jaspers was saying in his description of the axial age. And ultimately, this means people focusing on the importance for society of sacred literature. Spirituality that is ungrounded, that is make-believe, is not where we're heading. But there will be plenty of people who think that they're reading Zoroaster. There are plenty of people who will be going back to the Rig Veda. There'll be plenty of people who will be reading the EG. And as you might know, Zhang, for reasons I believe closely associated with this, the Communist Party of China is now teaching the I Ching to all of its new cadre, all the way up to the standing committee of the Politburo. So there is a revival of sacred literature of a very significant sort now going on in China.
Wonderful. Next up is Mark Klugman. Mark Klugman, you need to unmute yourself. There was noise from your line, so I muted you. Go ahead. You need to unmute.
There I am. I'm unmuted. Yes, good. Very interesting, Mark. I mean, I must be, I don't know, about 7 years ago, I had a conversation with George Gilder, who's a exemplary technological optimist.
Yeah,
and
I'm the guy who introduced George to much of Wall Street back in my Wall Street career. I know George.
Well, but in case you haven't followed it, it seems to have worked out, at least at that stage. So I came out of that conversation, I started thinking about it a lot. My conclusion was that the difference between being a technological optimist or a technological pessimist is not so much about listening to the technology. It's essentially, it's a theological question. Mm-hmm. That is, whatever you believe that the ultimate destiny of this universe is, will be your answer to the question as to the technology.
That's right.
I think in each of these transitions, oral, scribal, and so forth, there's a challenge to what sort of existential belief reigns. Okay. And for some reason, it seems like the transition from print to electric was very favorable to atheism.
Correct.
And was very tough on the established churches. And I think here some people are using the word religion when they really mean church, which are different things. Where we are now, I think, is we're heading into the collapse. I think the new technology is going to be associated with the collapse of the atheist church. And what is this atheist church? I think its key characteristics is it's a universe that's essentially random. It's an origin story that's essentially random and therefore purposeless. Right. And also that it's man-centered or human-centered. Right. You know, it's centered in us mortals. And I think those characteristics are in decline. I think the transition period means that there's going to be a tremendous sense, not just of disorder, but of loss. That is, that which is familiar to us is collapsing around us. So that would certainly make sense to cling to fantasies, because it's a way of maintaining some stability in our experience and perception of what's real. When the reality is, and in the group, there were great graphics done. I think the movie was Inception, where the reality would suddenly crumble around the protagonists.
Mark, we'll need to shorten it up because we are running out of time. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, and with that, we wrap it up.
Agreed, Mark.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Madeline. Madeline, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mark. This was just absolutely incredible. I love the history and philosophy of science, especially biology. So your language and the people you referred to were very familiar to me and made me feel like I was on solid ground in the discussion. I love Gibson as a descendant of my favorite guy, who is von Wexkull, who was applying basically systems or phenomenology to biology, but as part of a living world without bringing in vitalism. And he did it by talking about the organism's interactions with its environment, co-creating a world. And one of the things I liked that you talked about was the unconscious mind having been the glue. And now it's being replaced by these things called qualia, which I assume comes out of CBT, which I think is basically, I would also just draw an analogy to people who like biology, to thinking of that as spirituality or religion as being like intracellular fluid, like lymph that flows around and through the cells and nourishes them and supports them. It's not the big glamour thing that's out there. It's like the glial cells in the brain, which had been completely ignored until very recently. You know, they weren't the superstars, and now it turns out that nothing can function without them. So I hope that you will have a more prescriptive talk about what you think can be done in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. We got one last question from Stefan, and then we will wrap up. Stefan.
Yes, hi, Mark. So you were saying that in a world where technology just further and further takes over more and more roles that humans have had, like our jobs, there'll be an increasing need for religion, for people to have any sense of meaning in their lives. And I was wondering, what kind of religion do you suppose that would be? And do you think it would resemble anything like what maybe was a religion of yesteryear, like what the Greeks believed with their quote unquote mythological gods?
I believe it will wind up returning to sacred literature. Walter Ong, Marshall Mcluhan student, published in 1982, Orality and Literacy, in which he coined the term secondary orality to describe the electric world, the fantasy world. I believe we're now working ourselves into a secondary literacy. And so, as I've mentioned before, China, India, Europe, there'll be all sorts of different expressions, but I believe what will hold them together will be their remembering of the role of sacred texts in the formation of their civilizations. Our hope at the center is to help people as they go through that transition not wind up in another 30 years war. So the real challenge that we're trying to address ultimately at the center, as I introduced myself, Mark will find this funny, at the Antigua Forum last year, we were given 10 seconds to introduce ourselves in a kind of speed dating situation. So I described the center as, our job is to try to help prevent World War III. I figure that would be memorable, and so I will leave you with that thought as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mark. This has been amazing, and so many fascinating things have been put on the table. So folks, I mean, just like what we're doing with Julian Jaynes, my commitment here is to make these ideas accessible to anybody who wants to really understand them. You have to do a lot of work in order to grasp them. There is no option but to do that. The article that I have just posted in the chat, that is the best way I have found. I've been going through this entire book that Mark's organization has published, and that's the best article. So we will start with that. So I'll talk to Mark about when would be a good time, but that is the article. It's a beautiful summary of where we are, the search for meaning that people have, the kinds of solutions that they are being offered by people like Carl Jung and Jordan Peterson, of seeing what, where they are coming from, and then addressing, bringing in people like Magda Arnold and Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, of seeing what was the traditional way of handling it, about, thinking about human beings, and then taking it forward, looking at these various technologies and seeing, okay, how do these human faculties operate under these different things. Final thought I want to leave you guys with: 15 years ago, I threw away my TV. That's the best thing I've done. I recommend it very strongly. Don't turn it off, throw it away. All right, Mark, thank you very much. This was a great honor, great pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you all very much.
Bye.